My grandmother called it a family obligation weekend. That's what she said on the phone 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Her voice was bright in that specific way she uses when she's already decided something and is just waiting for everyone to agree. I was standing in the break room at work, half listening, stirring a coffee I'd already let go cold. "We need someone to go through the cottage before the sale closes," she said. "You know the property better than anyone, sweetheart. You used to spend every summer there." She wasn't wrong. I did know that cottage. Every creaking floorboard, every sticky window latch, every corner of that place on Georgian Bay that smelled like cedar and old paperbacks. My grandfather had built it himself in the late 70s, before my mother was even born. "When?" I asked. "The weekend of the 14th. Your mother and your uncle are taking the kids to Tremblant." "You don't ski, do you?" "I don't ski." She knew that. So that was how it was decided. Everyone else got Mont Tremblant, lift tickets, fondue dinners, the full thing, and I got a 4-hour drive north to sort through 40 years of family history alone, in November, when Georgian Bay is nothing but gray water and wind that cuts straight through your jacket. I didn't fight it. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I just said, "Okay, I can do that," and finished my cold coffee, and went back to my desk. My name is June. I'm 31 years old. I work as a library technician at a public library in Guelph, and for most of my adult life, I have been the family member who does the unglamorous things. I organize the logistics of Christmas dinner. I drive my grandmother to her cardiology appointments when no one else can make it work. I am reliable in the way that certain people get recruited to be reliable. Quietly, without ceremony, as though it was always just assumed. My mother has 2 children. My brother Elliot is an emergency physician in Vancouver. He saves lives, literally, and everyone in the family mentions this with a particular kind of reverence that I think is completely warranted. I am not jealous of Elliot. I love my brother. But I have noticed, over the years, that being a library technician in a mid-sized Ontario city does not carry the same conversational weight at family dinners as being a doctor. I've watched my grandmother's eyes light up differently when she talks about him. I've felt the subtle arithmetic of how family obligations get distributed, who gets asked to do what, who is assumed to be available, who is simply expected to say yes. I drove up to the cottage on a Friday afternoon. The 400 was slow through Barrie, then the roads got quieter, and by the time I turned onto the gravel lane that leads down to the water, the light was already going. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the silence. There's a particular quality to silence in November and cottage country. It's heavy, like the whole landscape is holding its breath. Inside, it smelled exactly as I remembered. Cedar and old books and something faintly mineral, like lake water, absorbed into the walls over decades. My grandfather's fishing rods were still in the mudroom. His rubber boots, cracked along the toe now, still stood beside the door. It felt less like a property awaiting sale and more like a place where someone had simply stepped out and hadn't come back yet. My grandfather passed away 14 months ago. His name was Walter. He was 83 years old, and he had been, in my understanding of the word, an entirely self-made person. He'd grown up in Sudbury, the son of a Finnish immigrant who worked in the nickel mines. He had put himself through Lakehead University on scholarships and part-time work, built a small commercial contracting business in his 30s, and over 30 years had grown it into something substantial enough that when he sold it in 2001, the number was significant. Not tech billionaire significant, but quietly, seriously significant. The kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself, that lives in sensible investments and paid-off properties, and an accountant who's been with the family for 20 years. My grandmother managed the money after he sold. She was meticulous about it in a way that my grandfather trusted completely. He said once, when I was maybe 16 and we were fishing off the dock, that the most important business decision he ever made was marrying a woman who understood what things were actually worth. I spent the first evening going through the mudroom and the kitchen, boxing up items for donation, setting aside things that family members had already claimed. My mother wanted the china set. My uncle wanted the canoe. Elliot had asked, via text if there was any chance the old Zenith record player was still there, and if so, could I bring it back? There was, and I set it carefully aside. On Saturday morning, I started on the study. My grandfather's study was a small room off the back of the cottage, with a window that faced the water. He used it for paperwork when we were up for the summers. I remembered him in there for an hour or so each morning, coffee in hand, looking like a man who was genuinely at peace with the life he built. The room had a wooden desk, a filing cabinet, 2 bookshelves, and a closet I had never, in all my summers there, paid any attention to. I don't know why I opened the closet last, but I did. It was mostly what you'd expect. Old coats, a shoebox of receipts from the 90s, a tackle box I didn't remember seeing before, and then, on the shelf above the coats, in a banker's box with a lid that had been taped shut, a collection of items that stopped me cold. There were files, financial statements, correspondence from his accountant, a folder labeled simply Estate Final, and my grandfather's handwriting, which I recognized immediately. He printed in block capitals, always. I knew I shouldn't read them. I also knew that the whole reason I was there was to go through his belongings, and these were his belongings, and there was no one else in the room, and it was November, and the wind was doing something loud and persistent against the east-facing window. I sat down on the floor at the closet and I read them. What I found was this. My grandfather had, over the 23 years between selling his business and his death, managed his investments with the same methodical patience he applied to everything else. He had a financial advisor he'd worked with since 2003. He had a diversified portfolio, Canadian equities, some U.S. exposure, fixed income, a real estate investment trust. He had a lake property in addition to the cottage. He had kept clear, organized records of everything. The estate, as best as I could understand from the documents in front of me, was considerably larger than anything our family had ever discussed. And then I found the letter. It was in an envelope, unsealed, with my name on the front in his block capitals. Just June. Nothing else on the outside. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. He had written it by hand, on the kind of paper he always used, cream-colored, heavier than regular printer paper. The kind you buy at an office supply store because you take written things seriously. The date at the top was March of last year, 8 months before he died. June, it said. If you're reading this, you've done what I always knew you would. Shown up when it needed doing. I want to tell you some things I should have said out loud and didn't, because I was from a generation of men who mistook silence for strength. That was a mistake, and I'm correcting it now, even if it's late. He wrote about watching me over the years. He wrote about the appointments I drove my grandmother to. He wrote about the Christmas logistics, about the way I had once organized his entire medical paperwork system when he was first diagnosed with his heart condition and no one else had the patience for it. He wrote about the summer I was 19, and I stayed at the cottage for 2 weeks with just him and my grandmother, while everyone else was doing more interesting things, and how we'd fished every morning and he had been happier that summer than he could easily explain. He wrote, I have seen how this family distributes its appreciation, and I have not always had the courage to correct it in the moment. Your brother is a remarkable person, and I love him completely. Your mother has a good heart beneath her blind spots. But you, June, you have something that cannot be taught and is rarely recognized in time. You know how to be present. I have watched you be present over and over, without asking for anything in return. I would like to return something now. There was a separate document folded inside the letter, a note from his lawyer, a woman whose office was in Barrie, confirming that my grandfather had updated his will in March of the previous year. The note outlined in the restrained language of legal correspondence that the primary beneficiary of the estate had been changed. I sat on that closet floor for a long time. I thought about my mother and my uncle at Mont Tremblant. I thought about Elliot in Vancouver, who had texted about the record player but hadn't called in 3 weeks. I thought about my grandmother who had organized this whole arrangement, who had, I was now realizing, perhaps known more than she'd let on when she suggested I be the one to come up here. I called my grandmother that evening. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting. Did you find it? she asked. No preamble. Yes, I said. He made me promise not to tell anyone until you'd read it yourself. He said you needed to find it in your own time, in your own way. She paused. He knew you'd be the one to go through the study properly. He said the others would have boxed it up without looking. I didn't know what to say to that. He loved all of you, my grandmother said. But he understood all of you. There's a difference. The call with my mother happened 2 weeks later, after the lawyers had been in contact and the information had begun moving through the family the way significant information always does. First as rumor, then as stunned phone calls. Then as a long dinner in my mother's kitchen in Oakville where no one quite knew how to look at each other. My mother sat across from me at her own table and said with genuine bewilderment, "But why you?" She didn't mean it cruelly. I actually believe that. She was simply asking the question that made the most logical sense to her, given the framework she'd been operating in for 31 years. The framework in which Elliot was the extraordinary one, and I was the dependable one, and those were simply different categories with different weights. I thought about how to answer. I thought about the closet floor and the cream-colored paper and the fishing mornings when I was 19. I thought about all the appointments and the logistics and the cold coffees in break rooms. I think, I said carefully, because I was actually there. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face that I couldn't fully read. Not anger exactly. Maybe recognition. Maybe the beginning of something more complicated that would take her a while to process. He could have told us, she said. He could have just said. Maybe, I said, but I think he wanted to show us instead. Elliot called me from Vancouver that same night, late, which meant he'd stayed up past midnight, which was not something he did easily after night shifts. He didn't say much. He said he was sorry we hadn't talked more lately. He said he was proud of me, which landed strangely. I didn't feel like I'd done anything to be proud of, exactly. I'd just shown up. I'd just been there. That's kind of the whole point though, right? He said, when I told him that. Yeah, I guess it was. What I did with what my grandfather left me is, honestly, not the part of the story that matters most to me. I have a very good financial advisor now, a woman in Guelph who had me walk through my entire situation before she made a single recommendation, which felt right. I've paid off my student loans. I've set money aside in a TFSA and an RSP in the way that, for most of my 20s, felt theoretically sensible but practically impossible on a library technician's salary. I'm still a library technician. I genuinely love what I do. I love recommending books to people. I love the kids who come in after school. I love the particular quiet of a library in the late afternoon when the light comes in sideways and everything feels temporarily like it has its proper place. The Cottage sold in February. I was the one who attended the closing, which I think was my grandmother's quiet way of giving me one last visit. I drove up in weather that was somehow even worse than November. Gray and sleeting, the road between Barrie and the turnoff slick enough to make me grip the wheel harder than necessary. I stood on the dock for about 10 minutes before the realtor arrived. The lake in February is something else entirely. It was frozen solid and the ice was the color of old pewter. And somewhere out past where the ice ended, there was open water that looked almost black. It was spectacularly bleak and also, in its way, beautiful. I thought about my grandfather standing in that same spot 40 years ago, building something from nothing in that particular stubborn way he had. I thought about what he'd written, that I knew how to be present, that it was rare, that it was worth something. I had spent a long time not knowing if what I did with my days had any particular value. Being reliable is not glamorous. Showing up is not something people build conversations around at dinner parties. It doesn't have the obvious narrative weight of saving lives in an emergency room or closing a major deal or whatever the thing is that gets recognized in real time while it's happening. But my grandfather had been watching. He'd been keeping, in his methodical Finnish Canadian way, an entirely different kind of ledger. And when it came time to settle accounts, he had been precise about it. The realtor's car turned down the lane. I walked back up from the dock. I didn't look back at the lake. I didn't need to. I'd already said what I needed to say, and so had he. I keep thinking about the drive home from the cottage that February. The sleet had stopped somewhere around Barrie, and by the time I hit the 400 South, it was just gray skies and wet pavement and the quiet hum of the car, and I had about 3 hours to sit with everything that had happened over the previous few months. The thing is, I hadn't done anything heroic. That's what I couldn't quite reconcile at first. I hadn't fought for anything. I hadn't confronted anyone, or made a grand speech, or forced a reckoning. I had just shown up to the cottage, to the appointments, to the Christmases, when other people had better plans. I had just been there. And somehow being there had mattered more than I ever thought it would. My grandfather Walter was a precise man. He kept records. He paid attention. He noticed what people actually did, as opposed to what they said they would do or what they wished they'd done. He had watched me for years with that same careful attention he gave to his financial statements, quietly, without drama, tracking what was real. And what he wrote in that letter wasn't flattery. It was an accurate observation. That's what made it land so hard. I think about what it takes to live the way he lived. Not the money, but the character underneath it. He built something from nothing in Northern Ontario, the son of a miner, and he did it through a combination of things that don't get talked about enough anymore. He was honest in a way that was almost uncomfortable. He didn't pretend things were fine when they weren't, didn't tell people what they wanted to hear just to smooth things over. He was sharp in the way that comes from actually paying attention to the world rather than just moving through it on autopilot. He read, he asked questions, he revised his opinions when the evidence changed, and he was steady when things went sideways, and they did. Over a long career and a long life, he didn't collapse, he adjusted, he kept going. I don't think I'm any of those things to the same degree he was, but I think I understand now what he was trying to tell me, that the unglamorous version of integrity, the showing up, the following through, the being present when it's inconvenient, is not the consolation prize. It's not what you do when you can't do the impressive thing. It is the impressive thing when you sustain it over time, when no one is watching, when there's no obvious reward coming. My mother asked me why him, why me, and I gave her an answer I believed. But the fuller answer is something like, because he was someone who understood that what you do in the small moments is the actual ledger, not what you announce, not what you intend, not what you'd have done if circumstances had been different. What you actually did, when it was inconvenient, when the easier option was available, when no one would have blamed you for choosing it. He kept that ledger for decades. And at the end, he settled it. I still drive my grandmother to her cardiology appointments. I still show up. Not because of what happened. The outcome doesn't change why you do the thing. But I notice now that I do it a little differently. Not waiting for recognition exactly, just knowing that somewhere, in some quiet and unhurried way, it counts.